Hello, everyone. My name is Jamia Wilson, and I am so thrilled and pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival. And I'm delighted to be moderating a conversation today with Kendra Allen, Jorie Graham, Donika Kelly, and Mai Der Vang. These brilliant poets are going to be discussing their explorations of survival and human resilience in the face of political and personal trauma and struggle. We've been through it for over a year now, and I'm just really happy that we're able to be in beloved community together today. I'm going to give you some brief author bios. I could go on and on about how great each of these people are. And then after we do that first, then we'll begin and start getting into questions. Kendra Allen is the author of award-winning essay collection, When You Learn the Alphabet, and the poetry collection, The Collection Plate. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, she loves dancing and leaving, loves laughing and leaving. I don't know where I got dancing from, but I think it's because I feel like this is revolutionary. And so I want to dance the revolution. Her work can be found on and in Repeller, Southwest Review, Frontier, The Rumpus, and more. My mind's been on Texas this weekend, so it's really good to have you here. Jory Graham is the author of numerous collections of poetry, including Runaway, From the New World, poems 1976 to 2014, Place, which won the Ford Prize in 2012, and The Dream of the Unified Field, selected poems 1974 through 1994, winner of the 1996 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her other poetry collections include Fast, Sea Change, Overlord, Never, Swarm, The Errancy, Materialism, Region of Unlikeness, The End of Beauty, Erosion, and Hybrids of Plants and of Ghosts. Oh, I love that title. She served as Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets from 1997 to 2003 and has edited 2 anthologies, Earth Took of Earth, 100 Great Poems of the English Language, and Best American Poetry 1990. She is the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at Harvard University and the first woman to be awarded this position. I'm also very pleased to connect and introduce you to Danica Kelly, who is the author of Renunciations and Bestiary, winner of the Cave Canem Poetry Prize, a Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the Kate Tufts Discovery Award. She is a Cave Canem Graduate Fellow and a founding member of the Collective of Poets at the End of the World. Her poems have been published in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Paris Review, and Fog Lifter. And she's an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Iowa, where she teaches creative writing. And last but not least, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Mai Der Vang, who is the author of Yellow Rain from Grey Wolf Press in 2021, and Afterland, also from Grey Wolf in 2017. Winner of the 2016 Walt Whitman Award of the Academy of American Poets. Mai Der is the recipient of the Lannan Literary Fellowship, and her work has appeared in Tin House, the American Poetry Review, and Poetry, among other journals and anthologies. And she teaches in the MFA program in creative writing at Fresno State. So this is a real treat to be with these legends today. And before I begin, I just want to let you know that each of their books can be purchased in the link below. So look down at that link and make sure to support these amazing poets. Now let's jump into the questions. Poet laureate Joy Harjo said that what often follows periods of decay and destruction and chaos is rebuilding and renaissance. Periods of fresh invention and thought and art, that's what often emerges from the ruins. You see little plants like after a fire coming up from the char. Since we're here to discuss the role of poetry in times of crisis, I want to ask each of these poets about a short selection that they would like to share with you today, thinking along these themes, exploring survival, human resilience, and connecting to that beautiful selection from Harjo. So Kendra, would you like to start us off?
Yes. First of all, just so honored and excited to be here on this panel. I'm going to read a poem called The Invention of the Super Sadness Was an Accident. Love that question because this book was created out of chaos and destruction. So yes, the invention of the super sadness was an accident. Show me how to make fun things or happy accidents, how to open up Sis's dolls, see how she blinks without a lifeline. If I'm little, show me how to win games and become a burned boy who's present enough to keep standing in doorways without shoving. Show me my name and its prototype. Let me craft elastic. Let me be better, even with the fear of water, even when I'm sent into planets to build bombs, to keep bombs from obliterating these burdens. Show me how to shoot these niggas faster, fill up tubs, carry space packs, become fire that holds silly knuckles. Show me the crack in my head, recede from the filthy state waters of 50 wet states. Wave, wave, make me artless, make me barren. Thank you.
Beautiful. And I want to snap to and just say, I'm just going to mute myself through all of these because I just keep hearing these involuntary witnessings coming from me. So this will continue, but just really happy and calling on all of you who are joining us to think of us as if we're in a big circle and snap and share and witness. Jory, would love to hear your selection.
When I was thinking about Joy Harjo's remark about things growing back up out of the burnt land, I think of a land right now where the sequoias are burning, where trees that, you know, are burning to such a degree that they don't know what will ever grow back. So it's a little hard for me to sign on to the pretty, you know, Pollyanna wishful thinking that we will make it automatically through if we just, you know, love each other and to try to create a community. It's really hard, you know, a community is a hard thing to do, especially when so much is monetized against our having a community. This poem is basically about what parts of the human soul, you know, theoretically, if we're going to build back, and this is a very large set of interlocking crises. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they all come from the same general source. They're not really distinguishable from each other. And one of the things that we've throughout history thought that would save us is self-knowledge. If we could only arrive at some kind of self-knowledge. And we seem to be farther from self-knowledge than probably ever in our history. This poem looks at those parts of the human being that are slower, more capable of wisdom, and ends with a part of the human being which is the most monetized by the technology that utilizes us and which bypasses wisdom and knowledge for information, and is the scariest part, and is the part that makes me wonder whether we can find that community that you were speaking about. It's called I, as in the first person. I know myself, I say to myself. So I cannot be led astray. Led astray. I say, I know myself more fully now. So I cannot be made to do something I, as an other, would never do. But I did it. Didn't I do it? It wasn't me to do such a thing or believe such a thing. I tell myself as I look carefully into the only mirror I am given, myself in there, me looking carefully and hard. I am honest in my looking, I think, as I see someone else in there opening, will in their eyes, wild like a sail in the wind. Wind rising now as I look in, bewildered. The old gentleness, where is it? I put my hand to my face, but it touches glass. Where is my body to guide me, I think? I tap at the prisoner in there. Is that the schoolroom? The blank in the lesson? Is that my soul gradually, by its 10,000 adjustments to its own increasing absence, opening too far? Is it blind? I tap my face, which is gone on the glass, which is not gone. Don't stop, I hear my mind hiss. Don't stop for anything.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So now we are going to hear from Danica Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you, Jory and Kendra, just really wonderful. And Mai Der, I can't wait to hear your work as well. I am not good at optimism. I'm not an optimistic person, but I have been working on cultivating hope, which is much smaller. It's a much smaller practice. And so I'm going to read the last poem in the collection, which I think is a hopeful one. And it's titled, "The Moon Rose Over the Bay. I Had a Lot of Feelings." The home I've been making inside myself started with a raising, a brush clearing, the thorn and nettle, the blackberry bush falling under the bush hog. Then I rested. A cycle fallow, said winter, said the ground is too cold to break pony, said I almost set fire to it all, lit a match, watched it ghost in the wind. Came the thaw, came the melting snowpack, the flooded river, new groundwater, the well risen. I stood in the mud field and called it a pasture, stood with a needle in my mouth and called it a song. Everything rushed past my small ears. Were in the leaves, were in the wing and the wood. About time to get a hammer, I thought. About time to get a nail and saw. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And now, excited to hear from you, Mai Der.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to be here virtually at the Brooklyn Book Festival alongside these incredible fellow panelists, and so lovely to hear all of your poems. So for me, when I think about the quote from Joy Harjo, I place that within who I am as a Hmong American poet and as a daughter of refugees. And I often think of crisis in terms of displacement or the sense of a loss of home, or the ways in which our lives can be upended overnight, which is what we've been seeing happening over the last year, over the last few months even. And it's almost as if everything we ever thought we knew was not ever what it was. And the shock of the realization is that crisis itself. And so sometimes we can be left in a state of limbo, waiting for something. And that waiting can happen for months, years. So the poem I want to share with all of you is actually also the last poem from my collection. And it's called "And Yet Still More." That refugees somewhere and everywhere are waiting. That the waiting suffocates the ankles, that the body cannot be fed from the waiting. That the spew of shrapnel from hubris tongues enact the waiting, that waiting is never certain of itself. That waiting could change its mind over morning, that waiting won't change its mind. That elbows cradle the waiting at night, that all are conceived and born into waiting. That the waiting can span the range of 2 continents, that waiting is a kind of forgetting, and forgetting is the sea. That waiting is a silent syllable, and never mind that even the dead wait. That waiting is not the same as faith, that not all waiting is created equal, that waiting drips from the sap hammer of a noose, that waiting turns to hunger, turns to water, turns to going, turns to too late. That a refugee somewhere is waiting, that a refugee everywhere is waiting, that waiting has no documentation of its history, that refugees carry a surplus of waiting in plastic bags, that the ancestors wait, that waiting is given to refugees as a disease is given to the blood, that refugees wait, that all waiting floats into the exosphere, that refugee fathers sit outside of high schools waiting for the bell, that landmines excel at waiting, that a sleeping refugee is still waiting even in a state of dreaming, that most waiting happens in daylight, that wait and home are not spelled the same, that the refugee industry is built on the business of waiting, that refugees are put somewhere to wait, that refugees are put everywhere to wait, that wait is the refugee, that a refugee is waiting, that waiting must go on, that there is yet more waiting, that waits still and still more, that yet even that next year, that the year after, that ever always, that more, that now, that wait is the refugee. Thank you so much.
Powerful. Thank you all so much. It's just really stunning, and thank you. So I have another question for you and would love to hear you each speak to this. I have heard poetry described as a bridge between people amid isolation and alienation, and I'd like to hear what you think about how poetry can help us make connections during such an uncertain and long period of social distancing. We're literally more apart than we usually are. And I'll speak for myself in saying that I feel distant in other ways, that I'm relearning how to be connected with people. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, and maybe we'll go the opposite way around this time. Mai Der, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to help us jump into this really great question. I think that for me, poetry puts us, or at least it puts me in a place to do the kind of work that can compel me to be a better human. You know, and I mean, who chooses to sit down and stare at a blank screen or at a blank sheet of paper for hours until something comes out, right? And so oftentimes the thing that, you know, for me emerges on the page is something that I could not have anticipated or even known was going to happen. And I also think that for me, poetry allows me to do the difficult work of going within myself, or going within and trying to carve some kind of rich interior life in order to confront the parts within me that are harder to access or reach, because, you know, my conscious mind would rather not go there, but my unconscious mind has already been doing the work of going to those harder places. And so I think what's beautiful about poetry and how it can break that isolation is that it allows for some kind of truth to come out, whether it's a literal truth or a spiritual truth or an emotional truth. And hopefully it's in these spaces of truth however nebulous those spaces can be, that like we might be able to find the potential for solidarity. So yeah.
Thank you.
I like what you're saying there about like that potential for solidarity, and that it resonates for me in terms of how I think about poetry as a writer, as an offering, and as a reader, as a reminder. It functions for me, poetry functions for me as a reminder that I am not alone, that there are people who have had experiences that are not exactly like mine, but that connect me to some larger part of the human experience. And so when I sit down to write, or there's what happens when I sit down to write, which sometimes is a little bit different, but when I just figure out that there's a poem I can share, it's an offering. It's like, I've experienced this. Does this make sense? And that's to the reader. It's meant to be a means of connecting. It's a gesture of reaching out and reaching toward. That has felt especially important in writing when I've been writing poems that are about really difficult subjects. Like a good portion of this book deals with childhood sexual abuse. And I know I'm not alone. It's a very regular experience, even though we don't talk about it that way. And so the poets who have come before me, who have written about those experiences, I remember how I felt when I first read them. And I was like, oh, I'm not by myself. So if I could be a part of that lineage of helping people know that they aren't alone, that feels really meaningful and matters.
Thank you. Jory.
These are really beautiful descriptions of what it feels like from the writer's point of view. I was thinking that for our listeners who've been through this pandemic and the solitude, what you've called the social distancing, which I think is a phrase that we're going to think about for a long time. You know, poetry has been around for thousands of years, and all those voices are alive and as intimate as they can be if we actually, as readers, know how to slow down enough to hear them. And part of what I think the crisis of our time is accelerationism on all fronts, because as I said before, you know, we are in, you know, in every possible way in a place where speeding us up is monetizable. It's where we are being used. And so it seems to me that the resistance of poetry, whether you're reading Homer or whether you're reading, you know, somebody, you know, on this panel today, the solitude that you go into when you read, if you read at a rate of speed where, you know, your senses are involved, you know, when you read poems and there are images, don't capture them as information. They're not scene setting the way imagery might appear in a novel. Images in a poem are deep and they have overtones. And if there's something to smell in a poem, smell it. If there's something to see, see it. If there's something to hear, make sure you hear it. You know, if there's something that's tactile, make sure you make your senses do it. Undergo the poem. Your solitude is instantly decreased because you're in conversation with someone long dead usually, but you know, right there present for you. When Shakespeare says at the end of one of his sonnets, where he's trying to persuade someone, you know, to love him, and he says at the very end, you know, that in black ink my love may still shine bright. He's speaking to us hundreds of years later, because if you imagine him, he's writing with a quill, dipping it into ink, and when he writes on his parchment, the ink sits on it, not quite absorbed, and it shines until it's blotted. So what he's saying is this line is as alive now to you, reader, as it is in this moment in which I, Shakespeare, have written it, where I haven't blotted it yet. It's still wet. It's still wet with the very instant in which I felt this, which is going to become the very instant in your inwardness where you feel this. And that communion, now not every poet does it for every reader, But when you find your poets who speak to you in that way, my advice is always read them from start to finish. Read everything by them, and don't bring your conceptual intellect, and don't bring your desire to unpack and understand, and just slow down and undergo the poem. If you've never read Emily Dickinson, just start from start to finish and don't read any criticism. Just read Dickinson until you're speaking Dickinson and she speaks to you, and you won't be alone. As somebody already said on the panel, we're not alone. We're just here for a very brief time. On the span of human existence, if you think of yourself in relation to geologic time, our little tiny 70, 80 years are not a very long stretch, but poetry has been here since the very beginning of our, the minute our vocal cords developed. One of the first things we did was sing, ask for rain, ask for propitious hunting. We invoked powers, and we tried to grasp those powers down into forms that would, communicate and capture power and give it to us, in our fragile state as in our early humanity. So that hasn't changed, and it's there for everybody. But one of the problems with the way we experience poetry that makes us feel even more lonely is that we are often asked, as young people in a classroom, by a poem, when it's read, we are asked, what does this mean? What is the author's intention? And it has nothing to do with why the person wrote the poem or how the poem should be received. The question is, what did you feel? What did you see? What did you smell, touch, taste? Do you want to do it again? And so, I think this moment has been an opportunity for many people to have that experience. And I think that it's, we're not alone. We've been through world wars. We've been through prior pandemics. We've been through, unbelievable ice ages. We've been through all sorts of stuff. And poetry has been there for us as humanity from the get-go. So we've had yet another one of those encounters with it, I hope.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, I love what my dad said about like the poem sort of like exposing like this truth about like yourself. I think for me, poetry has done that at times, but mostly it's been like that avenue that exposes like a fabrication within myself and like a lie. Like a lot of times, especially during social distancing, I found myself writing more about like lying to myself and like especially about my desires, lying to myself about what I desire in terms of human connection, because we've been so deprived of it. I have to write through it to like realize, which is a crisis on its own. Like a lot of times I don't know I'm in crisis until like I write the poem, multiple drafts of it, and then I look back and I'm just like, okay, so like you really do like touch, or like you really do like seeing people, or like you really do like, I just noticed these things looking back in hindsight. And I think like the poem has been poetry in general, especially reading poetry, especially reading like my friends who are poets, just my peers, people who I've been in like workshops with, that I would read their work and I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one who has been lying to myself like this whole time about like what I desire, or like what I hope for, or like what I need in order to like survive. Because I think I could survive with like a minimum everything, but like that's not really reality. Like you need people. And I think during social distancing, poetry has like been an avenue for me to like really sit down and like share it with those peers, like through email or like through text messages or like through virtual readings, where we can all just sit down and like come together and be like, we really are like a community of people who don't really have the language until like we see the language reflected. I think like a lot of times for me, like a crisis feels like a lack of mirroring and like a lack of seeing that like I will be alive in the future. And I think like with poetry, the language that like everybody just like cultivates, it seemed easy, but I know it's like super, super hard. Like you see it reflected back to you. That is the moment where you, for me anyways, I feel like closer to people. And I feel like the crisis is what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know the word I'm looking for, but that's what I love about poetry. I figure out the word I'm looking for. But yeah, I think that's my answer, like full stop.
Thank you so much. And you just made me feel this deep feeling of gratitude, because there have been a few poets who I have in my life who throughout the pandemic in their out of office reply always share poetry from other poets they love. And there's something that I always feel that is hard to articulate, but a feeling of connection and beauty and healing when I see that. And so thank you all for your beautiful answers. And it's just making me think more of, oh, whose poetry am I going to start sharing as a offering to other people who may email me to get that. So I'm going to hold myself to that as well. So the next question that I want to ask you is there a specific crisis among the crises we're living through that is beckoning you to write and create right now? And you have all spoken to the fact that there are many crises that are happening and have been happening for a long time, but what's specifically shaking you awake right now? Can we start with you, Mai Der?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you're right. There's so much. Like it's so hard to say that there is just one thing right now that I personally am consumed with. But I think for me, I've been, for me, it's my work has been, rooted in the thinking and the remembering of the continual plight of displaced people all over the world, immigrants, refugees. And that sort of ties into the continual struggle against institutional injustices, structural racism, misogyny, xenophobia, down to issues around climate change and the precariousness of this earth. So I feel like I could go on, and some of these are like the larger issues I feel, but I think on a more sort of personal, intimate level, given this pandemic, it almost feels like another crisis or another layer of grief that I personally am trying to work through, and that I know everyone else is too, is just how to just be again in this place, in this state, in this existence that we're in, and how to be with each other again, and how do we rethink what sort of this post or post, or maybe we don't even know if there will be a post, but what this state is going to feel like, and how we're going to move and exist through that space. So yeah, for me, it's just, there's just so much. I really can't pinpoint one thing.
Thank you. Danica.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo much of what Mai Der has said, in that there are so many things and so many systems that are functioning precisely the way they were meant to function, and are affecting people who now have more agency and voice and visibility. And where I have turned my attention, being the small animal that I am, I'm just like, I think also similar to what Mai Der is saying, I'm trying to figure out how I want to relate to people. And I am finding that the models available to me, the models that I grew up under in terms of how we relate to each other in an extractive way, emotionally, financially, whatever, like that's not working for me. And so I'm thinking about time. Jory mentioned this. I'm thinking about geologic time. I'm thinking about climate change and how old this planet is and how often the climate has changed. I'm thinking about whales and how they are with each other, connected across great distances, but connected, it seems, in meaningful ways nonetheless. I'm trying to get some scale and some scope. And I think that's what's making hope feel slightly more possible as a practice than it has been in the past. I just keep being alive, so I'm trying to figure out how to think about the future. So that's where I am. Those are the intersections that I'm thinking through right now.
Thank you. How about you, Jory?
Well, My most recent book is called Runaway, but it is the fourth in a tetralogy, which is actually going to be coming out as a book called To the Last Be Human, which includes Sea Change and Place and Fast and Runaway, which is clear that, you know, what the topic is, which is I've been deeply involved with the ways in which runaway climate change intersects with runaway technology, runaway carceral state, runaway racism, runaway, you know, the entire idea of the acceleration that the word runaway implies and why we use it even to describe inflation, okay, has to do with the fact that if our technology can get us into a state where we're reading individual poems as opposed to sitting and reading volumes, if we're constantly writing things that are short enough to fit on, you know, a screen, you know, where we're getting a feeling that we want to do things in tiny blocks of time, our attention span is collapsing, our ability to dilate and have, you know, to daydream, to, you know, experience intuitively things that have to do with, you know, intimations, that takes time. And there's a, you know, all of this leads to a really substantial difference between the way we come to acquire what we share and what we need to share as a community as a kind of truth. We are, you know, we're really aware of the fact that we're being moved towards information gathering versus knowledge or wisdom. Knowledge or wisdom dilates and takes time, and it takes experience, and you have to undergo it, and it doesn't arrive as a product. Information is what we're geared to sort of capture, get, and use. All of that is part of runaway capitalism, and it's embodied in basically our social media. So it's breaking our community apart. My biggest political activity right now is trying to figure out literally how we don't lose in 24. I'm very involved with electoral politics because we are in great danger of going back to something much more devastating than what we just left, because we've had actually a runaway steal, a legal steal of our, you know, ability to vote in most of the essential states for the way our Constitution is structured, the Electoral College. So the idea that we could be runaway totalitarianism is something that doesn't leave my mind, even as I'm sitting down writing about, you know, what it is to be in a drought at dusk and how a drought and dusk have to interact with each other. So I feel like we have to become a community again, which means trying to hear people who are radically different than ourselves politically, or we're going to have a civil war of some kind all over again. And people say we're already in a cold civil war. And, you know, part of what our technology does is make us into a herd. We move too quickly. We move like a herd. Herds go off cliffs. Communities survive and bond and hear each other. And so anything we can use our poetry for that involves building community, and as opposed to scattering into a herd and herding up in tiny herds, and, you know, is going to help us from going off, maybe potentially help us from going off a cliff. Hate to be so bleak. No hope in that.
Thank you.
Not bleak at all, like the truth. But yeah, for me, I think because I'm a Texan and Texans love to tell you they're Texans, I'm thinking about what's going on right now with like the gatekeeping of wombs. And it's something that's been happening before I was even thought of course, but like it just being so prevalent in the news right now. I'm thinking about that and all the isms and phobias that are like directly stemmed from that. It's very sad. It is very like make me mad. It makes me mad. And so instead of me like just writing directly about that, I strictly like write from a familial place in general. Like I'm always just thinking of how to bring everything back to my family and lineage and like where I like learned everything about myself. And I just been like thinking about blood. and lineage, of course, and like bloodshed within like my family tree, especially like the women in my family, and like just talking to them about that and like writing that way. So I won't just strictly write from a place of anger. Like, even though I usually start with anger with everything I write, but like I figure out other emotions the more that like I talk to them and like see what they've been deprived of and how it like mirrors back to like me, generation through generation. So yeah, that's been on my mind, and that is what I've been like focusing on.
Thank you so much. And I can't believe we're getting close to the end right now. It's been such a really powerful time together, but just hearing all of the things that you've each brought forth, I hope that everyone who's with us, ask yourself those questions as well, that we're asking you those questions and the poetry is asking you those questions. And I think that connects a lot with what Jory was saying earlier too, about how the poems make you feel. I felt that very much in my cells. And we have only time for one last question, but we won't be able to go all the way around. So I just want to ask it and then see if anyone feels particularly called to answer it. I have often thought about the powerful words from the late, great Toni Morrison over the past few years, as we just came out of a very strong period of upheaval and are in another period of upheaval. We die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. We've been in a really traumatic period of deep grieving, and yet we're still doing language. And as Donika said, we're alive. And that gives me fuel and joy and hope. And so I was wondering if we could even just do a quick, if there's one word of what gives you hope, to carry that with us. And one thing that I will just start with is hearing the anger gives me hope.
I'll say the laughter gives me hope.
What did you say?
Laughter.
I would say something very practical, which is the size of the coming demographic turning 18 before next November and the following November. The largest demographic group in the country is hanging on to them for dear life. And if there's anything you or anybody watching this can do to take time out of your lives and register those people to vote and get them to vote, especially in places where it has been now mandated that it's almost impossible for people to vote. If you can just help those, we have an enormous new voting demographic at a time when, they're going to try to make it impossible for them to be even remotely interested. That's a very banal thing, but maybe it's practical.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jory and Kendra. I think my people give me hope, broadly construed. And I don't know, they're definitely they're the folks who have kept me here. So.
Yeah, I'll end this too by saying that for me, I think what's been giving me hope lately is things that I'm finding that are outside of who I am as a human. And so I've heard, just in tonight's reading, I've heard sequoias and I've heard whales. So I think, even as vulnerable as they might be, I think the sequoias, the redwoods, the whales give me hope.
All of your poetry gives me hope. The fact that you are writing such extraordinary work at such an impossible time in history, and that you've come forward, each of you, with, I read all your work, and the fact that you are trying at the absolute height of the poetic power available to do the work without any faltering of faith gives me hope. It means that we have our hands around the flame that is poetry, and it will pass on to the next generation because you're here. So that gives me hope.
That's very beautiful. And it gives me hope that we're having this conversation right now. And for everyone who's joining us, that we are doing the language, and that gives me great hope. And I just want to thank each of our powerful and talented and thoughtful panelists today, Kendra, Jory, Donika, Mai Der. It was an honor to be with you today. And to everyone out there, please order books in the link below, support poetry, and support the Brooklyn Book Festival. If you liked it today, we want more and more of it. So we need you to make donations to keep this going and to keep this work happening. And if you don't have money to give and you have time to give, that is valuable too. So thank you, thank you, thank you. The Brooklyn Book Festival is celebrating its 16th year of presenting free literary programming like this. And we want to continue to have this offering for many, 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 many years into infinity and beyond. Sending each of you love and hope for a wonderful week. And thank you for the poetry, and thank you, community. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Jamia.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Bye.
Thank y'all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take
Thanks.
care.